Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show. Coming up today, urgent action needed. The world's leading health journals call on wealthy nations to step up and help Africa ahead of this year's COP summit. The future of fracking. Labour calls on the Tories to help end shale gas extraction, with the MPs debating the matter later today. The UK's advertising watchdog bans 2 HSBC adverts for being misleading about the company's work to tackle climate change. And the controversial move to axe Sweden's Environment Ministry as a 26-year-old becomes the country's youngest ever cabinet minister. Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show, where we track the changes to our world and interrogate some of the potential solutions to the climate crisis. Now, we start today's show with the countdown to COP27 firmly underway. Over 250 of the world's leading health journals have come together to urge world leaders to deliver climate justice for Africa. Now, the bottom line, richer countries must increase climate support for the African nations. It comes as devastating floods continue to impact large swathes of Nigeria, with over 600 people having died this year. Well, joining me now is Richard Smith, chair of the UK Health Alliance on Climate Change, which published this very editorial. Thank you so much for joining us on the Daily Climate Show, Richard. How do you hope the world reacts to this message? Because it's a simple message, isn't it?
Yeah, we've got 2 simple messages. So this is 259 journals, which is very unusual. It includes the Lancet, the BMJ, the New England Journal of Medicine, the National Medical Journal of India. And very importantly, the message is coming from 16 African editors of journals. And the first message is we must do everything we can to try and stay below an increase in temperature over pre-industrial levels of 1.5 degrees. The second message is that we can only have any chance of doing that if rich countries help poor countries. And we need to do this because they are suffering more, and yet we cause the problem. So we have an ethical obligation, a justice obligation, but also it's self-interest, because there's no way that we can stay below 1.5 degrees if we leave people in Africa and the South to suffer the damage from climate change without our help.
And Richard, it's good timing, isn't it, I suppose, with COP27 around the corner. How hopeful are you that climate justice can be delivered for Africa by COP?
Yeah, well, COP, as you know, is going to be held in Egypt, which is why we coordinated all these African editors speaking up. And I think there was some progress last year in Glasgow. There wasn't nearly the extent of progress we would have hoped for, particularly in terms of offering support to low and middle income countries. So we're hoping that this can be the COP where we really make a difference and recognise just how important this is. And I should emphasise, health journals are doing this because this is the world's biggest threat to health. Health is severely damaged by climate change. It's happening now. It's not happening in the future. But there is also a positive message, because if we do the kinds of things we need to do to respond to climate change, most of those things are also good for our individual health. So switching to diets that are largely plant-based rather than animal-based, driving less, exercising more, insulating our houses, all these kinds of activities. So luckily, and unsurprisingly in a way, what's good for the planet is also good for us as individuals.
And Richard, lastly and briefly, one of the highlights of the reports, I suppose, is in terms of adaptation. There big gains have been made in early warning systems. It's all hands on deck, though, that final message, isn't it, to make a real change for African nations?
Yeah. And you're right to emphasise adaptation, because a lot of the damage has already been done and is being done right now. So it can't be just a matter of mitigation, trying to keep the temperature down. It must also be adaptation. And there have been some developments in Africa, been some developments here, but we are in a sense, even further behind with adaptation than we are with doing everything we can to stop the temperature rising higher.
OK. Richard Smith, thank you very much for talking to us today. OK, time now for some of the day's other climate news for you. And scientists are warning that climate change could bring viruses in the Arctic into contact with new environments, increasing the risk of viral spillover. That's according to newly published research. So the research published in Proceedings of the Royal Society suggests that as global temperatures rise due to climate change, it becomes more likely that viruses and bacteria locked up in glaciers and permafrost could reawaken and infect local wildlife. Now, almost 1 billion children are at extreme high risk of climate change harms. A children's rights group has warned. Now, Kids' Rights Index, based on figures supplied by UN agencies, also said more than 1/3 of the world's children are currently exposed to heat waves. Kids' Rights warned that a lack of water affected 920 million children worldwide. Now, the world's second richest man has announced he's sold his private jet. Bernard Arnault said he wasn't very keen on being tracked by climate activists on Twitter because some accounts had been created on social media publishing the amount of pollution the jets emit, which were owned by the Louis Vuitton CEO and other billionaires too. The UK's advertising regulator has banned 2 HSBC advertisements for being misleading about the company's work to tackle climate change. The posters showed images of waves crashing on a shore and tree growth rings with the slogan, "Climate change doesn't do borders." Well, the Advertising Standards Authority upheld complaints that the ads failed to include significant information about HSBC's contribution to carbon dioxide and greenhouse emissions. Well, joining me now is Sky's Aisha Zahid. Aisha, this is a bit of an own goal from HSBC.
Yeah, absolutely. Although this is significant because it's the first time this kind of action has been taken by the Advertising Standards Authority against a bank for essentially greenwashing. Like you said, it comes down to these 2 adverts which first popped up back in October 2021, just before COP26. And they received around 45 complaints from the public. Like you said, they featured either waves crashing on the shore or tree growth rings with the slogan reading, "Climate change doesn't do borders," whilst also detailing information about HSBC's own green initiatives, namely their £880 billion investment into helping their customers reach net zero, and also their plans to help plant 2 million trees in the UK. But what it all came down to was the fact that HSBC failed to mention any of their own contributions to carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. The Advertising Standards Authority said that the posters omitted material information which made them misleading. They said that customers wouldn't expect HSBC to be making these claims, they say, while simultaneously funding companies that make significant contributions to carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. Like I said, it's the first time this kind of action's been taken against a bank, and campaigners hope that it's going to set a benchmark within the financial sector when it comes to putting out advertisements relating to the environment and climate change.
Aisha Zahid, thank you very much. The Labour Party is attempting to force a binding vote on fracking today, which would allow a bill to be put down banning shale gas extraction. So fracking was halted, wasn't it, in the UK in 2019 amid opposition from green groups and concerns about earth tremors. But that decision was reversed in light of soaring energy costs. Our climate change correspondent Hannah Thomas-Peter can tell us more.
Fracking is just one of those issues that won't go away. You'll remember David Cameron declaring that he was going all out for shale gas. And then a few years later and several earthquakes later, by 2019, there was a national ban on the practice. And it seemed like the industry was over in this country. But now we have a new prime minister in the shape of Liz Truss. She has lifted the moratorium on fracking. She wants to explore to see what's down there. Amidst an energy crisis, she's argued that expanding fossil fuel production in the UK is the right thing to do. However, this has infuriated a number of Conservative MPs, particularly in the north of the country, where there are lots of fracking licences already approved, whose constituents are very opposed to having fracking restarted on their land or near their homes. And it's meant that these 30 to 35 MPs have become strange partners or unlikely partners with Labour, a party which is also opposed to fracking, perhaps for broader reasons. They're interested in the direction of travel in this country. They want to accelerate investments in renewables. They see extracting more fossil fuels as a backward step. But whatever the reasons, we've got this strange partnership developing. And it's all coming to a head because Labour is tabling an opposition motion which would essentially today in the Commons start the process of forcing the government to reinstate the ban on fracking. And these rebel Tory MPs or potential rebel Tory MPs are toying with the idea of voting with Labour. Now, the government, Liz Truss, is obviously very concerned about this. There's now a 3-line whip in place. Liz Truss's operation saying to the potential rebel MPs, you can't allow Labour to take control of the agenda like this. This amounts to a confidence vote in the government. Labour is saying to these Tory MPs, you've got to think about what's right for the constituents and for the country, and you have to abandon your party on this issue. But for those Tory MPs, they've got a very difficult set of decisions to make because they know that if they support their own government on this issue, they risk the anger of their own constituents and therefore their own political survival the next time the country goes to the polls.
And finally, just before we go, Sweden has appointed its youngest ever cabinet minister. 26-year-old Romana Pourmokhtari has been appointed as the country's climate minister. Well, the new government in Sweden has been criticised after scrapping the Ministry of Environment, and the 26-year-old will work under the Minister for Energy, Business and Industry instead of leading her own department. Now, there's just over 2 weeks until the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Egypt, and you can scan the QR code on your screen for your full guide to COP27. Well, that's all from me. Back to you, Sarah Jane.